Welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Javier Guzman. I'm the director of the Global Health Policy Program, and I'm a senior fellow here. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this event on the fixing the market for antimicrobials, the importance of a grand bargain. And we have 6 recommendations to improve the antimicrobials market. So the first thing to say is, as you all know or might have heard, 5 million people die every year with an infection that is resistant to antibiotics, 5 million people. And out of that number, 1.3 million die because of that infection. Over nearly 90% of that number is actually in low and middle income countries. So low and middle income countries do have the main burden of disease. And of course, this is a problem of collective action. It requires stakeholders to act, it requires governments to act. And it's not just about antimicrobials. I mean, it goes from infection prevention and control, water and sanitation, animal health, human health. But here today, we're going to talk a bit about the work that we've been doing for the past year and a half, where we convened a working group with over 20 international experts to discuss how to fix the market for antimicrobials. We all know that at the moment, manufacturers are paid per drug sold. So the more they sell, the more they get. And that is not fit for purpose in terms of it doesn't secure access, it incentivizes overuse, and it doesn't actually, it doesn't incentivize research and development. Therefore, we, with our working group members, put together, some interesting recommendations after a lot of work that we're going to get into, and all that in preparation for a nice window of opportunity, which is the high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance at the next United Nations General Assembly in 2024. So today, it is my pleasure to first introduce Anthony McDonald, who is a senior policy analyst within the global health team at the Center for Global Development, who will do a short presentation on the work we've done, the methodology we used, and the main recommendations. After that, we'll have a stellar panel and then some questions and answers. So welcome again, and over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Javier. You should now all be able to see my screen. So I want to talk through some of the main findings from our working group and our report on that we released last week. This working group, as Javier said, had 23 members from 12 different countries around the world. I won't go through them all, but we were careful to ensure we had representation from governments, international organizations, academia, civil society, and other thought leaders in this space. And it was excellently supported by 2 great researchers, Catherine Klemper and Morgan Pincombe. We started this work by having a landscape review, which is a mixture of interviews and literature. And what we found is there's a huge divergence of opinion in high-income countries and low and middle-income countries, where people in high-income countries thought the main thing that needed to be fixed around antimicrobial resistance was in innovation, because we need new drugs. While in low and middle income countries, policymakers often felt that innovation wasn't a big concern at all because they don't have access to drugs at the moment. And so new drugs they don't have access to would have very little benefit. A lot of what brought together this work was about trying to find solutions that work for both these groups and bring these people together. We wanted to come up essentially with solutions that overcome collective action problems that have hampered implementation of antimicrobial resistance and overcome what is a dearth of research for solutions in low and middle income countries. And we want this to fit on 3 different axes: access, innovation, and stewardship, because if we don't have access to new drugs, then there is very little benefit to them. We need new drugs to replace the drugs that are lost to resistance, so innovation must be key. And we need to protect drugs from unnecessary use or they'll be wasted. And it's only through combining these 3 things can we really get ahead of the problem of antimicrobial resistance. And so we think it's possible to find a mutually beneficial set of policies and agreements that all countries can benefit from and all stakeholders will benefit from. And this kind of feeds into our 6 main recommendations from our report, which I will quickly outline now. Our first and our political recommendation is that we think there needs to be a grand bargain to an effective, affordable antimicrobials. We see four stakeholders here. I'll go through each of them. High-income country governments first. In return for ensuring access to effective antimicrobials, we think high-income countries need to agree to fund research and innovation into new drugs. And we think the funding should almost all come from high-income countries, as well as agreeing to protect drugs from unnecessary use, supporting clinical trials, collecting data, and supporting countries to other countries in low-income countries, supporting low-income countries with their national action plans, as well as funding their own national action plans. In low-income countries and middle-income countries, we similarly, in return for access to effective antimicrobials, these countries should sign up to support and conduct clinical trials and collecting data. They should also protect drugs from unnecessary use. We need to recognize that protecting drugs from unnecessary use is more challenging in resource-constrained environments. And both high-income countries and LMICs should support the creation of a sustainable action hub, which I'll come to in a moment. For the pharmaceutical industry, the kind of two big commitments we'd like to see is more funding in research and development and a greater emphasis on ensuring that everybody has access to innovative products. There's a few smaller recommendations there as well. And in return for this, we need to make sure that there is enough financial incentive or proper remuneration to fund that R&D and to fund that access. And finally, we think international organizations have an important role to ensure that all countries and organizations play their part in coordinating action, setting global standards and targets, and monitoring resistance, as well as providing technical and financial advice. Our second big recommendation is around what we call a sustainable access hub. And this fits a problem that we have at the moment, which is that often drugs which are manufactured do not reach patients in low and middle income countries, or indeed in many smaller high income countries, where it is not worth their while financially to register these drugs. And it's also quite cumbersome and difficult to create supply chains and registration systems to get drugs to every part of the world. There are kind of two ways around this in a way. We can either make it much more profitable to sell drugs into low and middle income countries, or we can make it much easier. And our option is the latter. And essentially, we propose what we call a sustainable access hub, which would, through pool procurement, purchase drugs from manufacturers and then distribute and register them to procuring agencies in low and middle income countries to be distributed. The benefits of this include ensuring that there's widespread access to drugs across the world. This should come with reducing inappropriate use of antimicrobials. We should include systems that track and report use that will reduce shortages, because through pool procurement, we can ensure that there is a more robust supply chain. We can also build in things like demand aggregation, so that we make sure that we have enough manufacturing facilities across the world to meet the demand and spikes in demand and supply shocks. And it should reduce prices through pooling resources. We also have 4 smaller recommendations that are also incredibly important. First of all, I want to quickly summarize some research by my colleague Rachel Silverman-Bonfield and Adrian Tao, which shows that there's a huge return on investment to high-income countries for funding innovation into new drugs. In the United States and Japan, something like the Pasteur Act or the UK subscription model, which generated the new antibiotics the world needs, would see a 28-fold financial return on investment to those countries if those drugs were created. And this is important because essentially it is in high-income countries' interest to fund new R&D. And so we think that they should do this. We also think more work needs to be done to ensure that the bacterial priority pathogen list and target product profiles meet the needs of all countries. And specifically that we create drugs that are oral and that are broader spectrum, as these are more important in countries where there is less money and lower levels of doctors, and diagnostics are harder and intravenous drugs are more difficult to use. And finally, in our report, we look at ways of designing methodologies for valuing new antimicrobials, because at the moment we often don't take into account the benefits that you get from a new antimicrobial that occur to people not taking the drug. And so health technology assessments are not fit for purpose. And the reason for these three things is kind of shown in the graph on the left. At the moment, 15.7% of deaths across the world are due to bacterial infection, but only 1.8% of clinical trials in phase 2 and 3 at the moment are aimed at stopping bacterial deaths. And so we think that more needs to be done to stop this, and it should be primarily led by high-income countries, as I said. Our fourth recommendation is that we need to strengthen regional regulation. Clinical trials products should undergo one clinical trial or one clinical trial per region, and that could be assessed by a single regulator instead of assessed by many regulators. Countries could jointly assess antimicrobials or have one country assess an antimicrobial on behalf of a whole region. And countries could work together on post-market surveillance, which means that instead of every country checking that manufacturers of drugs meet good manufacturing practices, that one country does this on behalf of a region. These harmonization efforts are already happening in places like Tahoe and through the Africa CDC. And we think it's important that antimicrobials be at the heart of this. Kind of our fifth and penultimate recommendation is about tackling unnecessary use. And we've come up with a range of policies that we think are both achievable, but will stop drugs being used unnecessarily. The first of these is that we need to craft prescription policies for watch and reserve antibiotics. And all of our recommendations on stewardship are based on the AWARE categorization, where we don't think there should be international targets on access drugs, but we think really important to protect reserve and to a lesser extent watch drugs. We also think countries should have to log, or doctors should have to log prescriptions of reserved drugs, explaining why those drugs were prescribed. And this will both discourage unnecessary prescriptions and also let us understand why these reserve drugs are being used. The third is we need to develop reporting and database systems to track how antibiotics are used and where. We're already seeing a lot of digitization of medical systems and databases, and antimicrobial resistance information should be part of this. We need better diagnostic tools so that we can see which antibiotics people need, and so that they're not prescribed unnecessarily. And finally, as part of all of this tracking, countries should also be encouraged to track access to make sure that any policies that are designed to encourage unnecessary use don't lead to people who need an antibiotic not getting access to it. And our sixth recommendation is to set global targets. We want to set global targets around innovation. We think these should be set out as first to come up with target product profiles for the number of drugs that the world needs, and then to look at the stages of development for drugs in the antimicrobial pipeline and see, do we have enough drugs at each phase to make it so that we are likely to meet these target product profiles? So only about 13% of antibiotics are in phase 1 trials ever get approved. And so if we need 2, say, gram-negative antibiotics, and there's only 2 or 3 in phase 1 trials and none elsewhere in the portfolio, we don't need to wait for those antimicrobials to fail to realize that we have a problem and we need to increase investment. Secondly, we think it's really important to track access, and we should come up with measures of the number of people in the world who need antimicrobials but who do not have access to them at the moment. And thirdly, we need better targets on stewardship. We think these targets should be based on the AWARE classification and should be based on defined daily dose per capita, so that each country could be essentially given, have to declare how many per capita use there was of access, watch and AWARE drugs. And any targets should reflect the fact that it is more difficult in resource-constrained environments to enact stewardship products. And so there's going to be likely more prescriptions in those parts of the world, and might want to take into account other factors such as disease burden or temperature. Finally, these need to be independently evaluated to make sure that all countries are playing by the same rules, and to hold countries that need to do better to account, but also to praise countries that are doing a very good job around stewardship, access, or innovation. And so those are our 6 recommendations. I very much look forward to the discussion of these further. Back to you, Javier.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have 3 panelists, 2 with us and 1 who will hopefully join very soon. So our first panelist is Merfin Mpundu, who he is the director of React Africa. Our second panelist is Brenda Warning, who is the chief of the Global Drug Facility. And our third panelist, who hopefully will join soon, is Ramanam Lakshmarayan, founder and president of the One Health Trust. So first of all, Merfin and Brenda, you've been with us in this journey. You both have been members of the working group. So thank you very much for all your contributions and all your support. And I guess the first question to get started is, what are your immediate reactions after you heard Anthony talking about all these different recommendations, from the political, which is the grand bargain, down to the operational, including the Sustainable Access Hub, better value in antimicrobials, regulation, targets, evaluation. There's a lot there. But I mean, you've been part of this journey. And of course, Brenda, you were part of the negotiations last week for the high-level meeting for TB. So very interested to hear your views about what is it that is most relevant, most appropriate at this point in time. So Brenda, do you want to get started? Over to you, and welcome to CGT.
Thanks very much, Javier. And thanks for the invitation to join today. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously this report is very comprehensive and it covers a lot of area. And I think it's important when you're, trying to come up with a kind of a paradigm shift to have that big picture. But then when it comes to implementation, I think in having any kind of success from something like a high-level meeting, I think the more you can break it down into something that's implementable in smaller steps, realizing you've got the big picture in mind, I think that becomes more palatable and manageable and practical in terms of implementing. So I think that's kind of where we're at, is there's this big sort of, all-encompassing recommendation that covers pretty much everything. And where do you start? What drugs do you start? What areas do you start? Who do you start with? And I think that's, to me, the next steps. And hopefully, and in the lead up to the high-level meeting, which always has aspirational goals, but also think about, if you're really trying to implement something that's really something to deliver, then you need to think about practical targets, practical next steps, who's going to engage, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Merfin, what are your initial reflections on the recommendations and the window of opportunity and the upcoming? I mean, we've got a year high-level meeting on AMR in 2024. Welcome to CGT, Merfin. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It's been, like you said, I think it's been work that has taken many months, and it has been, the group was quite representative in terms of, trying to get something that we could agree on. We obviously really recognize that there is inequitable access at the moment, and the drivers also of AMR are quite different in a sense. I mean, some may be similar. When one is looking at really high income countries, one would see that the major drivers really of AMR, largely it is actually overuse and misuse. But when you look at the low middle income countries, one will obviously see that the major, drivers really social determinants of infectious diseases. And so, where we actually place this and balance that, I think is critical. This report, of course, generates different views, and it does, though, make very good recommendations that I think are really critical. So when we're looking at the negotiations of the high-level, agreement in 2024, it will be very crucial. And I think what the Grand Bargain has done has to be able to, provide a framework, that ensures really sustainable, equity, efficiency, there's effectiveness, accountability for all stakeholders that are involved in the AMR agenda. And so the Grand Bargain really does set the commitments, and I think it does define them even further. Some of the points that, are just mentioning a couple to start the conversation is, we looked at the fact that, we need an end-to-end approach in terms of actually addressing the issues of access and innovation. That is just beyond multinational pharmaceutical industry, but that actually, brings a solution, brings policymakers, donors, and other group actually that really play in the ecosystem that's emerging, biotechnology, generic companies, and product development. The key things that are really critical is that our innovation and focus when we're looking at really equitable access to actually quality assured antimicrobials should be founded and be driven by public health needs. And we know that, Sub-Saharan Africa has got the highest burden of infectious diseases, but it's one area that would not have sufficient funding to be able to address the issues of access. So I think the principles in the Grand Bargain that looks at actually equity, we have to work towards UNGA 24, come up with an agreement that ensures that all people have access to affordable and appropriate antimicrobials, regardless of where they are. We have to ensure that there is efficiency, in the pipeline to complement existing resources. We have to be able to ensure effectiveness, that, the agreement should actually deliver measurable results, like Anthony was saying, and impact actually terms of reducing AMR-related morbidity and mortality. And also, there has to be the issue of accountability. The agreement should establish clear roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders, as well as the mechanisms for monitoring, evaluation, and enforcement of the agreement. We should require creating a global antimicrobial commission that probably would foresee the implementation of the agreement and hold countries and other stakeholders accountable for their commitment. This would be my initial reaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murphy. You went ahead with comments on the Grand Bargain, and I think this is our political recommendation, and that's the one that we'll be, trying to push for in terms of, getting people to understand what it is and why it's important and why now, what exactly we mean by a Grand Bargain. So, Brenda, what are your thoughts about? Is there a way to incorporate the principles in the lead up to the negotiation? Who are the stakeholders? What are the best way to get the different players to negotiate and agree on those principles that could actually be explicitly spelled out in that political declaration?
Yeah, so obviously we know that WHO is the host and the convener of the high-level meetings on health. So obviously they play, a critical role in figuring out how to work within the activities that they're already organizing is really important. And I think, I'm coming from this perspective of market shaping and access and delivery side. And here, in the Grand Bargain, when you're talking about, agreements on market shaping, this is, something that it takes a village to manage, right? It's not just one organization. And here, what you really need is to have all of the stakeholders that comprise the relevant market come together in some organized forum and discuss, okay, what do we practically do? Do we agree that there's parts of this that can move forward? And I think, that includes, of course, WHO, that includes the suppliers, the countries, ideally, the countries that can be early adopters into using, buying into something like this, NGOs, of course, civil society plays a huge role in the high-level meeting and in advocacy on the ground and the implementers. And I think, WHO GARD-P have the Secure Initiative, which is a perfect umbrella to host these discussions with the relevant stakeholders, because it has WHO in the lead already. And, typically when you talk about the kinds of things that are in your report around market shaping and procurement and delivery and access, there isn't really a place for those types of discussions. And so being able to use an initiative like Secure to say, okay, we can have those discussions here and bring in the relevant stakeholders and agree on, okay, what parts of this can we think about moving forward and coming up with a practical plan, like Mirfin said, that has some accountability. I'm not talking about the big, high-level aspirational targets that'll be in the high-level meeting. I'm talking about on the side, how do you actually implement this? Because I think that's where we really need to move. But I do think that, if we don't start with something concrete and then bring the groups together that would be working around whatever that concrete first step is, then it's just going to be theoretical. And I would hope that between now and then we could, take the lead of WHO and work within whatever they've already started doing and the Secure Initiative to see if we can start having some of these discussions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. Very, very important point to mention Secure, which is an initiative by WHO and GARD-P, and could actually be an interesting umbrella, not just for the conversation, but also for what we call the Sustainable Access Hub. Now, Mirfin, a lot of people have talked about whether the African countries would be interested or would be ready to negotiate or to discuss the grand bargain. And that's basically talking about the elements of access with stewardship, with targets, with, as you said, independent evaluation. So what are your thoughts about the appetite to have these conversations and these negotiations?
Yeah. Clearly, there is actually interest in the African region, and as we've seen, especially after COVID, we now have actually the African Medicine Agency. We have seen lots of funding that are going into strengthening national public health institutes on the globe. We have seen some investments towards the issues of surveillance and getting data, not just microbiology data, but actually consumption data. We have seen also that countries are trying to move and evaluate and assess their capacities and abilities to actually have local manufacturing as one of the solutions that could actually, that has been impeding really access, because, over 90% of the antimicrobials used in the region are actually imported. And so there is that wide gap. But we also have to be really cognizant of the fact that, the region is equally very challenged with, really weak health systems that needs to be actually strengthened, including the procurement processes. So, moving towards, the issues around pooling and what it's a good direction, I think, to start moving in. I think African governments and African countries, don't want their people to die because of, lack of access. But, there is the political direction and support that is emerging in that direction of actually ensuring equitable access. And so I think, some of the, the major highlights of this report are really in sync with where really Africa is at the moment. The issues of establishing really sustainable hubs, for example, that would coordinate and facilitate. Our volumes, even when we pool, they are not comparable to Europe, neither to North America. And so there has to be a way in which negotiations allow that even pooling small volumes might make a difference. I think we need to ensure that actually innovation is properly valued and meets the needs of low and middle income countries by creating funding streams and funding systems, but also really supporting countries and including countries also in terms of what was mentioned earlier, in terms of clinical trials. We have not seen that. We need to move towards harmonization of laws within the region so that if a molecule is registered in one country, it should easily be registered in another country. Now it takes on average about 2 years to get a registration. We need to be able to control and track the unnecessary use of antimicrobials so that we ensure that only the people who need them have actually access. But that also means that we have to set targets, and these targets, of progress that will allow us to, look and measure innovation, look at the issues of access, see the, drivers of misuse. But really, at the end of the day, we have to be able to bring together, African leaders. And I know that they are also, working on some recommendation towards UNGA 2024. But, it's all really around, how do we address, and this is where the Grand Bargain, offers, some of these, recommendations that, resonate quite a lot with the African countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Murphy. Yes, we think the Grand Bargain is, the framework, the political agreement that could provide this win-win-win output. And of course, it's not just about what you get, but what you give. Like, is the realization that you do need to have rights and responsibilities. And you mentioned something very interesting, which is, regional entities and the role regional entities will be playing, not just in the implementation, but in the negotiation. In New York last week, we heard from the Africa CDC and how they are planning to convene African countries to have a unified position and to, have a single voice on these negotiations. But let's shift gears a bit and let's talk a bit about, something you both talked about, which is reality, which is changes on the ground. And I guess we talk about the Sustainable Access Hub, and we talk about sustainable because we think sustainable basically implies a long-term vision, and that implies appropriate stewardship. And of course, access is basically the essence of this conversation. We see access as a prerequisite for a functioning health system. Is part of the conversation on basic health services and infrastructure. So with that, with thinking about this Sustainable Access Hub and how you operationalize something like that, Brenda, what are your thoughts on what's the right approach, what's the right level? I mean, what do you take if you say, okay, let's do it globally and let's have something like an expansion of the GDF, or let's say let's fund secure, or let's say, is it regional? Is it about Africans getting together regionally and do it? We were very flexible in the way we phrase the recommendations, but we want to hear your views on how we get the Sustainable Access Hub off the ground. Before you respond, I just want to remind our audience that they could submit their questions by Twitter. So if you tweet at CGDev with the hashtag CGD Talks, or by email, if you email us at events@cgdev.org, or if you include a comment in the YouTube chat window, we'll answer your questions. So over to you, Brenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Javier. So I think, the answer to your question is probably all of the above, right? So I think, it's not a one size fits all when it comes to figuring out what's the mechanism to actually support access to these products. And it really requires, like I said, some organization, some place where people can come together to say, okay, really every product needs to be reviewed to say, what are the access issues? What are the market issues? What are the barriers? What are the incentives on both the supply side and the demand side? And when you go through that exercise, you might find that, the volume is so small, you really need a global person, a global entity to negotiate with a supplier. That doesn't mean that you can't have regional that buy through the global, which is what happens with us with PAHO, for example. PAHO is a very effective regional pool procurement system, longstanding, and because their TV volumes are so small, they end up procuring through GDF because they would never get the same kind of access terms and whatnot. So I think you really have to go case by case and say what works best for the market and what works best for the countries. What do they want? I think, if you're really talking, most of the paper was really focused on the reserve antibiotics. And, even within the reserve antibiotics, you're going to have a range of just how small or big or fragmented that market is. I think, we have a lot of experience in GDF working in TB because all of our markets are small. Some of them are ridiculously small when you get into the drug-resistant TB. And, the report talks about the ability to sustain shocks, supply shocks, demand shocks. I mean, TB lives in a constant state of shock, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's our norm. And I think that's going to be your norm for some of these reserve products as well. And I think it's even more challenging for some of these very low volume reserve products, because at least in TB, generally speaking, as long as somebody's not critically ill with TB, you have a window of time to reach them. So if you don't have supply in country, it's not ideal, but it's very different than not having supply to a new antibiotic that treats gram-negative resistant antibiotic, and somebody's critically ill, and if they don't have it within a few hours or a few days, it's going to be potentially fatal. It's a completely different situation. And so the systems that you set up to be able to make sure somebody can get something in that period of time in a low volume market, that's a big challenge. Here, you're not talking about things like surge capacity, because that doesn't help you if somebody has a shock in country in terms of no stock, right? So I think, these are the things we have to think about. And when I think people don't realize what we're asking of suppliers when we're asking them not only to innovate, but then to supply to the world. What does that really mean? For low and middle income countries, for the most part, you're talking about 150, 160 countries potentially that could want a very low volume product. I mean, we have medicines where we send 1 treatment a year to a country, 10 treatments a year. You may not have that low in your reserve, but you'll have very low volume countries. So if you're looking at very low volume, so that in any given country, a supplier is not going to make a lot of money, but you want them to open an office, register a product, reply to a local tender, supply in the local currency, package the 10 treatments in a local packaging, this is not going to happen, right? So I think what you have to do is unpack all of that and say, that's probably too big of an ask for most of these products. And so how do we then take away some of those requirements? And that's where this type of an access hub comes into play, is that you can look at, what are all of those challenges that the supplier faces in terms of trying to provide medicines to a large group of countries, but it's just from a cost perspective, from a human resource perspective, it's in order to do that, the price of the product would be so high that you don't have your affordability, or it's not even possible in some countries. And so that's where you look at what are the concrete things that we can do, and you have a lot of them in the paper coming out of this this access hub, and we do have a lot of experience in GDF with this. So we have our own labeling, so they don't have to deal with individual country labeling. 4 languages, works all over the world. We take care of supplying tiny orders to countries. The suppliers, they can just supply to us once a year if they want to. We can have a stockpile. We can supply to the countries as they need. We can supply to regional platforms. And it's about, understanding for each product, for each supplier, what is it that will make it easier for them, that'll make it more efficient for them, that'll make it less costly for them? Because generally speaking, and it's different for every supplier, but generally speaking, if you can have an honest discussion about what would it take and what can we do, and then implement these small things that have a huge impact on their cost of business, their transactional costs, generally speaking, they will do it. And then you also have to work on the client side. What is it that the country needs to buy into this, the client, to make this work for them? And do the same exercise with the clients to say, obviously it's a lot of work for them to go through that same process, the tender, et cetera, and have nobody respond. And that happens often. So how would they like to have their procurement organized in order for it to work within their system, within what they want for their needs? That could be packaging. It could be how they procure, going through a regional versus us. It could be supporting them with launching the tender, helping them get the products registered when they need to be registered. It's all kinds of things, but it's really about how do you evaluate the situation, product by product, country by country, and come up with some system that meets the needs of most, that can actually be implemented in a win-win way. I think that's what we're trying to do, and I think that's what the report is trying to suggest. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. That was a wonderful response. And it's great that you are saying it's not actually either or. Sometimes you will need both. So you will need regional, but you will need global. And it comes down to what products, what suppliers, how you reduce the barriers to entry, how you facilitate access to make it sustainable. So thank you all very much for that. We in the report provided a few options, and we are at the moment discussing with interested parties, because what we want, what we call success, is basically getting funders to think about this possibility as a viable possibility. And we're not talking about creating a new institution or a new top-down vertical fund. Is more about using the existing architecture and increase it marginally, and deliver something that is fit for purpose. So Murphy, you mentioned something about the Global Antimicrobial Commission. It's the first time I hear that term, and I very much like it, because that basically talks about one that is an independent tool that is not a one-off, And clearly we all need to, I think we all recognize the need to have an ongoing conversation rather than meeting every 6 to 7 years. So what are your thoughts about that commission? Like any particular views on the how, the who, the whether there's appetite for it?
Yeah, so I think in the framework and those who've read the report or those who are looking forward to reading it, I think when we look at the sustainable hub, it can be called anything, like you just said. It's not tied to really being called really is basically a sustainable access hub. But I think it can play a pivotal role in operationalization of a political agreement to improve antimicrobial market by addressing some of the key challenges and barriers that we know about, to limit the availability, affordability, and appropriate use of antimicrobials, especially in low and middle income countries. I think there are some functions and benefits that would be quite critical. The coordination and facilitation of food procurement and distribution of antimicrobials, as food procurement is a giant in itself. It has, a lot of complex factors that one has to look at, but there are good examples, that have succeeded. We're looking at actually creating this sort of a pooled demand. Again, this could be, one of the functions really of provision of overall leadership in terms of probably such a commission, and then provision of the technical assistance, being able to build capacity in country in terms of really focusing in terms of selection, in terms of distribution, being able to also assure that what is coming into the country is actually quality assured and minimizing really falsified and medicines that are quite actually prevalent in the region. It could also help actually create a bit of a stockpile, I think, in terms of managing the demand side and the demand shocks, stabilizing actually fluctuating markets and counteract routine stockouts. But in order for this to really happen, we need a strong political commitment and leadership. That the hub would require strong political commitment and leadership from countries and other key stakeholders to participate in this sort of a hub, as well as to provide adequate fund, really financing and governance mechanisms that really ensure sustainability and independence. This needs to also align with the national priorities and policies. The national action plans actually provide a framework, and one of major strategic goals there is about really ensuring a really equitable access. And when we start looking at that, it also starts going into the fact that we have to talk about universal health coverage, ensuring that every human being under the sun has got access to these molecules and diagnostics. It is also really important that there is the balance of access and innovation, because if we introduce a new molecule today in the current situation we are in the African region, in most of the countries, we will lose it very, very fast. Because, and again, I think that's one of the reasons I keep saying, if we create a framework and ensure that the current molecules that are perpetually, chronically out of stock are available, this instrument, would be able to provide that. And I think there has to be really collaboration in decision making. The hub needs to work with global organizations like WHO and other national authorities to actually come up with consensus. I think that is very, very key. There has to be also inclusivity. I think that is key. Environmental responsibility. We ensure that the ecosystem is maintained, that this pollution that occurs is not actually happening, both from actual influence in the healthcare systems, but also in production. The market dynamics, the hub, would understand and act upon the delicate balance of affordability. Just recently, amoxicillin was out of stock in a number of countries, including high-income countries. We had actually benzothine. That was another issue that we had to actually deal with as a global community. So I think there is, last week, there was a side meeting at the UNGA sidelines, and the issue around targets came up quite a lot in the conversation. And I think what will make a difference, is that, and part of these are actually IACG recommendations that were done really a few years ago. But, there has to be, a driver to that. And that driver, that consensus, that sort of body, really works on a number of fronts, including regulatory frameworks and ensuring, again, that we have processes and systems that is able to accommodate even the small small volumes that some countries are going to procure because they are small countries, but also looking at their financing situation. I think those are going to be critical, I think, in this case, Javier.
Thank you, Marvin. And we've got a question from the audience. And I guess, Brenda, it'd be great to hear your views. And I alluded to it at the beginning because of the high-level meeting on TB. So the question is, what can we learn from this year's high-level meetings to inform the preparation for next year's high-level meeting on AMR? Brenda, any reflection on what we can learn from, not just from TB, if you have anything to say on pandemic preparedness or universal health coverage, please, over to you.
Well, I guess one thing I would say is you don't see them talking about this in TB because it's been existing for 20 years, right? And I think, just understanding where AMR is in its discussion around, how you get to that place. I mean, GDF is mentioned in the political declaration, this one and the last one, as a preferred entity to use. And it was a big part, along with many others, of actually building that market. We're not there with AMR. We're starting off where TB started 20 years ago on the access and delivery side, right? So I think that we have to keep that in mind, and we probably need to be more prescriptive when it comes to the how we will reach these when you talk about the access and delivery side than TB is, because TB, it's just a given that the entity is there and it works and it serves, and it's one of the oldest entities to provide that service. So I think that that's I think that that's probably the most important thing to think about when you compare TB to AMR, is that, there's probably not a big difference when it comes to, setting the health targets. When it comes to trying to incorporate something like this report, we're starting from nothing. Yeah. And TB doesn't even talk about it because they already have, the whole platform. So you probably want to bring in more language about the how into AMR than that you don't need in TB. Otherwise, we'll just end up having meetings that don't reach the access goals, because as your friend started and said earlier, and Anthony started in his earlier remarks, we know we have a lot of problems. And I think we've been talking for years about the need for something to support the access and delivery side of things, and it hasn't yet materialized. I think now we have a bit of a roadmap. We have to pull together a coalition of the willing and figure out what part of that needs to actually be, if not included in the actual document, somehow referred to, or a work plan on the side of it, because they're just in two different states of evolution. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I guess we are coming to the end of this conversation. So just wanted to ask, your final concluding remarks. What next? Where do we go from here? What would you say? And I know you've alluded to some of these elements during this conversation, but we've got 1 year to do our best and to deliver on, this high-level meeting. So Merfin, then Brenda, and then Anthony will close, if that's okay. So Merfin, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think this is, I think what we are doing is really, having a conversation. I think a document like this one comes probably at the right time, as our countries deliberate and they discuss these issues. And as you had asked me earlier on, the Africa CDC is actually working on this, and I'm chairing the group that is working on this. But just very quickly in closing, I think that there are opportunities. We learned a lot from COVID-19, and the pandemic really illuminated the urgency of addressing global health threats and showcased the potential for innovation, for collaboration, and unity across countries and stakeholders. We were able, the strategies that were applied during the pandemic, especially regarding the development and the distribution of new diagnostics and treatments and vaccines, they can provide valuable lessons as we respond to actually AMR. There has to be an increased awareness as we move towards UNGA 2024. The report actually emphasizes, on one hand, one opportunity to establish a sustainable access hub that can overcome barriers that we've talked about in smaller markets. But this could only help and work if essential antimicrobials and diagnostics reach the people who need them. We have to be cognizant of the challenges that we've had and find ways of working around them. Challenges around regulation and legislation, that needs to be looked in depth, and we prepare for that. The funding gaps, they need to be looked into, but also the complex antimicrobial market needs to be looked at. I think Anthony started off that the current model is, of course, driven, by volumes of sales as opposed to looking at the public interest. So I think we need to look at those areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Merfin. Brenda, what are your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Merfin, and obviously funding always comes up as an issue, right? But it's definitely an issue here. And, we are starting to see some amazing product coming out of these initiatives like, CARB-X and GuardP for discovery and R&D. And we've got some amazing donors that have contributed to these products coming to fruition. And we need to make sure that they're now available to people in low and middle income countries. If there's not an inequitable distribution of these products, that the donors have invested in development, licensing, et cetera. So I think, like I said before, we've been talking about this for a long time. Now we have, a very comprehensive report that provides some specific recommendations on how to move. And now it's time for action. Now we just need to do it. And we need to start with something small. We can't take on the entire AMR market. We can't take on entire reserve market. I think, what we're hoping to do, we're really excited to be working with GARD-P to see if we can help with, providing a mechanism to help them get one of their drugs to low and middle income countries. And like Mirfin said, we do need donors to step up on the access and delivery side now. We've got the products. Now we need something to kickstart that. We have all of the people in place. We have the Secure initiative that can house the discussions and the planning. We need a concrete plan between now and September, so we actually have something to say and not just more talk, and something in action. That's what I think we need to aim for 1 year from now. We're not just talking, but we have something to say, that something has started. Start small. You work out all the details as you actually start implementing something, and let's move.
Thank you, Brenda. Anthony?
Great. Thank you both very much. It's obviously you were on the working group, so it's a biased sample, but it's great to have so much agreement on the ideas we're putting forward. I completely agree with Brenda and Mirfin on the need to have a plan and to take this forward. We did actually in the final report write out a draft of what a grand bargain could look like to show that it was possible to put language to some of these recommendations. My first hope is everyone says that's great and signs off on it tomorrow, but otherwise I think this should be used and can be brought in with countries in low and middle income countries and high income countries and industry to flesh out what an agreement could look like. And then I liked a lot of the comments about the importance of the access hub, and I think researching which products should be taken forward, which levels for different products, as well as kind of concrete steps to take this forward, and funders getting involved and looking at who's going to fund it, where's the money going to come from, and what this will cost, I think are really important next steps that we hope that somebody will take over, either through USAID is doing some work in this space, Secure and the WHO are doing lots of interesting work. There's a private group, Aranda, is doing some work on this as well. And obviously CGD is still interested in working in this space. So there's lots of questions to answer. And I think kind of merging that with the kind of more concrete steps, hopefully we can overcome these product problems and catch up with where TB was 20 years ago.
Well, thank you all very much. I will close with, this call for action and this call for funding and this call for starting small, but, tangible results. So thanks to our audience, thanks to our panelists. Thank you all very much and have a good day.